A park in occupied Amsterdam, 1942. A German officer sits alone on a bench, eating his lunch. He notices a young girl walking toward him, maybe 13, maybe 14. Dark hair, school clothes. She smiles at him the way children smile at adults, open, harmless, a little shy. She sits down nearby, starts talking. Her German is decent. He's flattered. Far from home, missing his own children, perhaps. They talk for a while. She laughs at something he says. Then she asks if he'd like to take a walk, see the canal path. It's beautiful this time of year, she tells him. He agrees. They walk together into a narrow stretch of trees along the water. And there, where the path bends and no one can see, a second girl steps out from behind a birch tree. She's holding a pistol. The officer never makes it back to his bench. The two girls ride away on their bicycles, unhurried. Two schoolgirls heading home for dinner. Nobody looks twice. This is not a story from a film. There is no score swelling underneath it, no dramatic close-up, no hero's speech. This is just what actually happened in a small Dutch city called Haarlem between 1941 and 1945. And the girls at the center of it were not soldiers. They were not spies trained by any government. They were sisters from a poor family who slept on straw mattresses and made dolls for children in war zones because it was the only thing they could afford to give. Their names were Truus and Freddie Overstegen. And before either of them turned 17, they had already killed more Nazis than most armed soldiers ever would. To understand how two teenage girls ended up assassinating Nazis in Dutch forests, you have to understand who raised them. Their mother's name was Trintje. Everyone called her Trine. She was a communist, a true believer, not in the distant theoretical sense, but in the immediate practical sense. She believed that injustice was not something you observed. It was something you stopped. When Jewish refugees started crossing into the Netherlands from Germany in the late 1930s, fleeing a regime that had already begun stripping them of everything, Trine opened her small apartment to them. The family had almost nothing. A tiny place in Haarlem, mattresses stuffed with straw, barely enough food. But there were always strangers sleeping on the floor, people whose names Truus and Freddie sometimes never learned, political fugitives, families on the run, people who had nowhere else to go. The girls grew up understanding something most children never have to learn, that comfort is not a right, that safety, when it exists, is something you share. Their father had already left by this point. He sang a song from the bow of a boat as he sailed away, a French farewell, and Freddie remembered watching him go. She rarely saw him again, but his departure didn't break the family. Trine held everything together through sheer force of belief. She told her daughters one thing above all others. If you have to help somebody, you have to make sacrifices for yourself. It wasn't a lesson she wrote down. It was one she lived, every day, in every choice she made. And her daughters absorbed it the way children absorb everything, not by being taught, by watching. May 10th, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army held for 5 days, then it surrendered. Freddie was 14 years old, Truus was 16, and overnight, their city changed. German soldiers stood on corners that had been empty the day before. Nazi flags appeared on buildings that had displayed Dutch ones. New rules arrived daily. Restrictions on movement, on speech, on who could go where, who could buy what, who counted as a person under the law and who did not. Freddie described it later. She said she remembered the sound of rifle butts against doors, the Germans banging and shouting, the noise carrying through entire neighborhoods in the middle of the night. She said it was the sound of fear becoming something physical, something you could hear from your bed. But the Overstegen family did not lie in their beds listening. They acted. Train began printing and distributing illegal pamphlets, anti-Nazi literature, underground newspapers that told the truth about what was happening, while official channels were forced to lie. Freddie and Truss helped. At night, they would slip through the darkened streets with buckets of paste and rolls of paper, covering German propaganda posters with their own messages. The Netherlands must be free. Don't go to Germany. Every Dutch worker in a German factory is one more German soldier freed for the front. Then they'd get on their bicycles and ride away before anyone saw them. 2 young girls on bikes. Nobody paid them any attention. That invisibility, that assumption of harmlessness, that was the first weapon they ever had. And they were already learning how to use it. The resistance found them in 1941. A man named Franz van der Wiel came to their door. He was the commander of the Haarlem Council of Resistance, part of the network operating underneath the occupation, invisible and everywhere at once. He had heard about the Overstegens, the mother who sheltered refugees, the daughters distributing illegal papers in the dark. He sat down with Trine and asked if her daughters could join the resistance. Freddie was 14, Truss was 16. Their mother said yes. The girls said yes. But van der Wiel wasn't ready to trust them yet. Trust in the resistance wasn't given. It was tested. Because one weak link, one person who broke under pressure and gave up a name, meant death for everyone connected to them. So he came back a few days later wearing a different face entirely. He arrived dressed as a Gestapo officer, bursting through the door with a weapon drawn, screaming in German, demanding to know where a Jewish man was hiding. Freddie and Truss did not freeze. They did not give up any names. They fought back physically, attacking the man they believed was a Nazi, refusing to yield even when they thought it might cost them their lives. Van der Wiel stopped, revealed himself, told them they had passed. Then he told them what the work would actually involve: sabotage, blowing up railway lines, burning Nazi warehouses. And then the part that changed everything: you'll learn to shoot Nazis. Truss looked at her younger sister. Freddie grinned. Well, she said, that's something I've never done before. They learned to shoot in an underground potato cellar. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. Not a military base, not a training facility, a hole in the ground beneath a field where someone stored vegetables. That was where 2 teenage girls from Haarlem learned to kill. They learned in darkness. They learned to aim steady, to breathe slow, to stay calm when everything in their body was telling them to run. And then they emerged back into the daylight and became teenagers again. Their first missions were not assassinations. They started with distraction. Nazi supply warehouses needed to be destroyed, but German SS soldiers guarded them. The resistance needed a way in. The solution was Freddie and Truss. They would approach the guards, talk to them, smile, be young, be female, be harmless. While they kept the soldiers occupied with conversation, the rest of the team slipped in from behind and set the fires. It worked every time. The warehouses burned. The guards never suspected the girls who had been laughing with them moments before. Because who would suspect them? They were children. They were female. They were nothing. That was the assumption the Nazis made. And it was the assumption that would get dozens of them killed. Van der Wiel understood something important after those first missions. He saw what these 2 girls could do that no man in his network could. They could get close. They could stand next to a target without triggering any alarm. in an occupied country where every adult male was a potential suspect. A young woman or girl was invisible in a way that was more valuable than any weapon. He gave them harder assignments. Freddy's first kill was not a German soldier. It was a Dutch woman. The resistance had received intelligence about a collaborator, a Dutch citizen, one of her own country people, who had compiled a list of every Jewish resident in the region, names, addresses, every family, every individual. She was preparing to hand this list to the Nazis, and once the Nazis had it, those people were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. The resistance assigned the target to Freddy. She rode her bicycle to the park where the woman would be sitting. She found her, a woman alone on a bench. Freddy walked up, casual, just a girl with braided hair and nothing unusual about her at all. She asked the woman her name. The woman told her. Freddy confirmed she had the right person. She drew her pistol. She looked the woman in the eyes, and she fired. Then she got on her bicycle and rode away. Later, when asked what that felt like, Freddy said something that has stayed with people who heard it ever since. She said the first instinct after shooting someone is to pick them up. Even after you've killed them, the instinct is to help. That impulse, she said, never left her, no matter how many times it happened. She carried that contradiction for the rest of her life. The methods evolved as the sisters learned what worked and what was too dangerous. The forest walk became one of their primary techniques. One sister would go alone to a bar or tavern where German officers gathered off duty. She'd find a target, start a conversation, be warm, be engaging, let him think this was something it wasn't. Then she'd ask if he wanted to take a walk, into the trees, somewhere quiet. He always said yes. They'd walk together into the forest, deeper and deeper, until the sounds of the road were gone and there were no witnesses, and nothing but birch trees and silence. And there the other sister would be waiting. One shot. The officer fell. They buried him in a hole that had already been prepared. Then they walked back out separately, got on their bicycles and rode home. Other times they used speed. Truce would cycle while Freddy sat behind her. They'd identify a target on the street, ride past him, and Freddy would fire as they went. Then they'd keep going. Two girls on a bicycle heading somewhere. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to remember. We always went by bike, Truce said later. Never walked. Walking was too dangerous. I always made sure the road was clear first. It worked very well. The doorstep approach came later. Sometimes they'd identify a target's address and his routine. Then one of them would knock on his door. When he opened it, he'd see a young woman, young enough to seem unthreatening, standing there with some ordinary pretext. By the time he understood what was happening, there was no time left to do anything about it. In 1943, a third member joined their cell. Her name was Hani Shaft. Everyone called her Hani. She came from a completely different background than the Oversteegen sisters. Middle-class family. Father was a teacher. She had been studying law at the University of Amsterdam, intending to become a human rights attorney. Then the Nazis required all students to sign a loyalty pledge to Germany. Hani refused. She was expelled. She didn't go home. She joined the resistance. Hani had features that made her dangerously memorable. Red hair, green eyes, pale skin. The kind of appearance that people noticed and remembered, that witnesses described accurately and quickly. It was something she knew, something she worked around. But it would eventually become the thing that killed her. Vanderveel tested her the same way he'd tested the Oversteegen sisters. He handed her a weapon and sent her to shoot a Nazi officer. Her hands shook. She raised the gun, pulled the trigger. Click. Empty. The officer revealed himself as Vanderveel. She had passed. Now the three of them worked together. Hanny was the intellectual. She planned. She thought through every detail before anyone moved. Truce was the decision-maker. Decisive, fast, the one who made calls that couldn't wait. Freddie was the scout. She mapped everything, memorized every exit, knew every street before they ever used it. Together they became something the occupation had no category for. They didn't only kill. They blew up railway lines that were being used to deport Jewish families to concentration camps. Every rail junction destroyed bought time. Some of those families made it because a bridge wasn't there when the train needed it. They smuggled Jewish children out of the country, sometimes walking them across borders in the dark. No documents, no official help. Just these young women who knew the routes and were willing to walk them at 3 a.m. with someone else's child in their arms. They forged identity papers. They stole documents from Nazi offices. They passed intelligence about German troop movements to Allied contacts. They were not simply assassins. They were an entire operation compressed into 3 people. But the killing continued. The collaborators were, in some ways, the most dangerous work. Not because German soldiers were easy targets, they weren't, but because Dutch collaborators moved freely through Dutch society. They knew everyone. They spoke the language, knew the customs, understood exactly where people hid and why. They were cancerous, as Truce put it later. You had to cut them out like a surgeon. There was no court, no arrest, no alternative. Then came the order that the 3 of them refused. The target was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner of the Netherlands, one of the most powerful Nazis in the country. The mission was not to kill him. It was to kidnap his children, use them as leverage, force him to release resistance prisoners, and if he refused, kill the children. Freddie, Truce, and Hanny refused. Freddie's words were simple and final. We are not Hitlerites. They had killed. They would kill again. But not children. Not the children of their enemies. Not the children of anyone. That was the line that separated what they were doing from what the Nazis were doing. A line they drew and held, even when their own leadership was asking them to cross it. One afternoon, Truce was cycling through the city when she saw a Dutch SS soldier, a Dutchman who had chosen to join the Nazi forces, standing in the street holding an infant. A family stood nearby, screaming. The soldier raised the baby and smashed it against a wall. The child died immediately. Truce stopped her bicycle. She pulled out her pistol and shot the soldier where he stood, in the middle of the street, in daylight, with people watching. It wasn't an assignment. There were no orders, no planning, no escape route prepared. That wasn't a mission, she said later, but I don't regret it. Some things don't need orders. By 1944, Hanny Schaft was one of the most wanted people in the Netherlands. Her red hair had been seen at too many scenes. Witnesses had described her too many times. The Nazis issued a bulletin, "Find the girl with the red hair." She dyed her hair black, wore glasses, changed everything about her appearance she could change. But she didn't stop. In June 1944, she and another resistance fighter were assigned to kill a Dutch collaborator. The mission went wrong. The collaborator was shot, but didn't die immediately. In the chaos, her partner was shot in the stomach and captured. He held out through interrogation, until a Nazi officer pretended to be a resistance member, a friend who wanted to help, speaking to a dying man who had lost too much blood to think clearly. He gave up Hanny's address. Then he died. The Nazis raided her parents' home and took her mother and father to a concentration camp. Hanny went underground. For months she hid. If she was captured, everyone she had ever known would die. She had become too dangerous to herself and everyone around her to keep fighting. But she couldn't stay hidden forever. March 21st, 1945. The war was weeks from ending. Everyone knew it. Allied forces were advancing. The occupation's final days were being counted. Hanny was cycling through Harlem with an illegal newspaper and a pistol when she was stopped at a checkpoint. They searched her, found everything. Weeks of interrogation followed. Solitary confinement, torture. They knew they had someone significant but needed confirmation. Then someone noticed her roots, black hair growing in over red. They had found the girl with the red hair. Hanny confirmed what she had done. She confessed to her assassinations. She admitted everything about herself. And she gave up nothing about anyone else. Not Freddie, not Truce, not a single name. April 17th, 1945, 18 days before the Netherlands would be liberated. There was already an agreement in place between the Nazis and the Dutch resistance to stop executions. The war was functionally over. Everyone knew what was coming. A Nazi officer named Willy Lages ignored the agreement. 2 Dutch collaborators were assigned as executioners. They took Hanny to the sand dunes outside Overveen, the same dunes where hundreds of resistance fighters had already been killed and buried. The first man fired. The bullet grazed her head. She was wounded but alive. She looked at her executioner. "I shoot better than you," she said. The second man raised a submachine gun and fired. Hanny Shaft died in the dunes. She was 24 years old. They buried her in a shallow grave, so shallow that her red hair was still visible above the sand. The Netherlands was liberated on May 5th, 1945, 18 days later. After liberation, they found 422 bodies in those dunes, 421 men, 1 woman. Hanny was given a state funeral. Queen Wilhelmina called her the symbol of the Dutch resistance. Freddie and Truce received nothing. For nearly 7 decades, the Dutch government ignored them. Because they were communists. Because during the Cold War, that association was enough to erase what they had done. The girls who killed Nazis to save their country were treated like threats to the country they had saved. Truce became a sculptor. She made memorials. She wrote her story down. She refused to let it disappear. Freddie got married and had children and tried to build something ordinary. But she couldn't sleep. Nightmares came without warning. Every year on Remembrance Day, she woke with dread she couldn't explain to anyone around her. When people asked how many Nazis she had killed, she always gave the same answer. One should not ask a soldier any of that. She never said the number. Neither did Truce. Neither of them ever apologized. Neither of them ever claimed it hadn't cost them. They carried it privately for the rest of their lives, the weight of every trigger pulled and every choice made, and every night in occupied streets, wondering if this was the night they didn't come home. In 2014, 69 years after the war ended, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte invited them to a ceremony. He awarded them the Mobilization War Cross. Freddie was 89. Truce was 91. Freddie's son said it was the happiest day of his mother's life. Streets in Harlem were eventually named after them. Books were written. Documentaries were made. But for most of their lives, they had lived in silence, in a country that owed them everything and gave them nothing. Truce Overstegen died on June 18, 2016. She was 92 years old. Freddie Oversteegen died on September 5, 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday. For the rest of her life, Freddie visited Hannie Schaaf's grave and left red roses. During World War II, 90% of the Dutch population tried to live as normally as possible under occupation. 5% collaborated, 5% resisted. Of that 5%, only a handful of women took up arms. Of those, only a very few ever killed with their own hands. Freddie Oversteegen was 14 years old when she fired her first shot. She had braided pigtails and a pistol hidden in her bicycle basket, and a mother who had told her that helping people means making sacrifices for yourself. She was not a hero from a story. She had nightmares until she died. She cried after every kill. She spent decades being ignored by the government she had bled for. She raised children and lived quietly and carried things inside her that she never put into words. But when the moment came, when she was 14 years old and her country was occupied, and the people around her were being taken from their homes in the night, she made a decision. Some things are worth killing for. Some things are worth dying for. And some debts, the kind owed to teenagers who decide to fight monsters rather than look away, take far too long to pay.